Warte mal, hört ihr mich alle noch? Okay, weil ich habe hier irgendwas. I am Jana Hauptmann, the president of WIZO Austria, and I want to welcome you, friends of WIZO, and our guest in Kiev, the Austrian Ambassador in Ukraine, Dr.Arad Benkö, who found the time to attend our first WIZO Zoom talk this year, 2023. Given the fact that the topic of tonight's talk is very important and will interest a large audience, we decided to hold it in English. Mr. Ambassador will speak about his experience and work in Kiev, especially about the issue how much Russians' war against Ukraine affect us all. But before we start, I would like to put your attention on our bank account in the chat below. WIZO Austria sponsored 2 daycare centers of children up to 3 old in Israel, in Rehovot and Modi'in, giving maximum care to 75 children each in order to support the families and in their daily work and obligation. Therefore, any donation is highly welcome. I passed on to our Secretary General, Petra Winkelbauer-Ankermann, who will lead you through our event.
Good evening, everybody, and good evening, Arad Benkö. We are very pleased that Arad accepted our invitation for tonight. And let me just introduce Arad to you. Arad studied at the University of Vienna. At the University of Vienna, he studied as well at King's College London and the College of Europe in Bruges. He started his diplomatic career in 1988 in Bonn, Germany, then in Pristina, Kosovo, Bukarest, Tel Aviv and Brussels. Beginning of May 2022, he was, I forgot to tell you that he was appointed to Austrian Ambassador in Riga, Latvia, and in Tiflis, Georgia. Now for May 2022, he is the Austrian Ambassador in Ukraine. After his speech, you will have the opportunity to ask questions or to comment on any issue of his speech. Please, I ask you all to mute yourself so not to disturb the speech of Arad. And now, Arad, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Petra, and also Jana and Caroline. It's like a family business that we are doing here to a certain point. So that's why I'm smiling a bit to myself, seeing you and knowing you partly for like 40 to 50 years. No, 40 years. Let's leave, as we say in German, the church, die Kirche im Dorf, in the village. Okay, so it's a big pleasure for me to be your guest today for the WIZOOM talk. I'm sitting at the moment in the office in Kiev at the embassy. It's 7 p.m. It's dark outside. It's always dark outside since we have hardly any electricity in town. I will try to be not too long because from experience I know that there are always many questions ranging from different range of perspectives and ideas. If you talk about the Ukraine-Russia war, or better, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, you need to know a little bit of history. Before I went, and Petra mentioned it, to Latvia, then later to Georgia, and now to Ukraine, I had no clue what's in the East. As a Jew, I only knew that the East was not a good place to be, and the 20th century was a mass grave experience for millions of Jews. So if you would have asked me if I wanted to go to Ukraine a couple of years ago, I would have definitely said no, because I associate probably like some of you with Ukraine, not too many memories or associations, definitely. What is the history of Ukraine in a nutshell? Ukraine was actually created, was sandwiched between the West, which was Poland and Lithuania, the Polish and Lithuanian kingdoms, and in the East, the Russians. In between were the peasants. The peasants were the Ukrainians, or they didn't call themselves Ukrainians, they had different kinds of names. But this was a nation that over the last centuries has always been sandwiched between two major powers, either the Russian Tsar, the Tsarist Russia, or the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom. They were usually enslaved or used as peasants either by one kingdom or the other kingdom. There were rebels, you know the name Kosaken, the Cossacks kingdom that they had as well, the Hetmanate as they call it. Brutal people that did many bad things, especially against Jews, like all the others did. But they were in Ukraine, they are like heroes. They are being idolized and they represent the nucleus of statehood. If we make a bigger jump to the 20th century, you know that in the beginning of the 20th century, the most developed Ukrainian nationality was in those territories that were part of Austria-Hungary. Austria, in the part that Vienna ruled, was very federally oriented. That meant that those parts that were Ukrainian, or as we call them, Ruthenian, inhabited, they had a lot of possibilities to develop themselves. When I came to visit for the first time the mayor of Lviv, Lvov, he told me, you know, you were the best occupiers that we ever had. So Austria, Vienna especially, is very much loved in the western part of Ukraine because we were the first to give them the opportunity to establish a university, to speak the language, to have schools with the language and to develop. The years after the disintegration of both the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire were extremely bloody, whereas in Europe, in Western Europe, the First World War ended in 1918, the war continued on a different scale in Eastern Europe. And the borders were going back and forth between Poland and Russia. You know, the Red Army was kicked out of Poland. Poland enlarged to the east. And I don't want to go into too much historical details, but the fact is that there were millions of killed. We in Western Europe, we hardly know about what has happened in these territories, but it is true that these were killing fields, or as Timothy Snyder, the historian, wrote, these were the bloodlands. And these bloodlands didn't stop to be bloodlands, because from the wars between Poland and Russia came the Stalin's terror against the peasants, the so-called Holodomor, which was a forced famine. From the Holodomor came the Second World War, which started with Nazi Germany's attack on the Soviet Union and the occupation of Kiev, for instance, for 2 years, and then the Red Army rolled back. So whereas the Ukrainians were happy when the Nazis came, they thought that the Russian zone of influence would be finished. They were deeply disappointed because the Nazis behaved even worse than the Russians or the Soviets. So when the Soviets came back in 1943, 44, 45, it was like liberation for them. So on the one hand, the Ukrainians were killed by famine. They were also killed by Stalin's purges. They were killed because they were part of the Red Army, with the highest percentage of killings were Ukrainian soldiers. And then And then, yeah, then there was the end of the Second World War. And I think more or less everything in Ukraine or in Belarus, of course, were in total ruins. In 1991, Ukraine finally became independent. And there was a referendum in which all territories voted for independence, including Crimea. Also, Crimea voted with, I think, 54 or 55% for being part of Ukraine. Also, the eastern territories that are now occupied by Russia voted by a majority of about 70-75% pro Ukraine. If we look to the other side, to Russia, we are confronted with a country which has been always an imperialist country. And today it is I think, one of the last, if not the last, imperial or colonist country that still exists. Most other countries, starting from Austria-Hungary in 1918 to France and Britain in the 1960s, they all lost their colonies, or the Ottoman Empire in 1918, 1919, but Russia did not. And the Russian psyche is a very difficult and brutal one, and it is understood that Russia could not accept that Ukraine would get out of the Russian universe. And when Ukraine started to become more and more interested to join the European Union, to join the Western nations, to introduce democratic laws, Russia became more and more nervous, and especially Putin tried by many activities to stop the further disintegration of Russia. When Ukraine was about to sign an association agreement in 2013-14 with the European Union, and a revolution broke out in Kiev, the so-called Euromaidan, in which cause the president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, was kicked out of the country. He fled. And shortly after that, you know the story, because you still remember the Crimea, the referendum on the Crimea, which was finished with, I think, 99%, and then the beginning of the occupation in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, which from a Ukrainian perspective was the beginning of the war. From the perspective of here, this war lasts already almost 9 years. For us in the West, of course, it's a bit different. We more or less forgot what was going on in the East. And if speaking of myself, I had forgotten it. And I probably, before coming here, I would have said, why don't you just give the Donbass to Russia and that's it? Let's leave it like this. However, it's not that easy. On the 24th of February, Russia invaded Ukraine, and even the Ukrainian government thought that they cannot survive this attack longer than a couple of days. But the Ukrainians are patriots. You could also say, especially in the West, that they are very nationalistic. And of course, since 2014, they had a lot of support by the United States and by NATO. So the Ukrainian army of 2014, when the Crimea was occupied, annexed, is not the same army as today. And so the resistance was very, very strong. And with the support of Western partners, it was possible to push the Ukrainians back. I will not go into detail where we stand or how the military development continued. But when I arrived here on the 2nd of May, we still didn't know how long we could keep the embassy open. By summer, the tide had turned and a lot of more military weapons had come into the country. Today, we are in a situation which is a bit like Verdun in 1915, 1916. It's a tragedy that every day hundreds soldiers are dying every day. We assume that there are about up to 200 to 300,000 killed soldiers, and there will be also more civilians that have been killed in the last almost a year. What was the impact of the war? Of course, first of all, it was the refugees. We got about 10 to 12 million refugees, either internally displaced or refugees that are now in Europe. In Austria alone, we used to have up to 90,000 refugees. I think at the moment about 50,000 of them live off the so-called, I don't know how to say it, Grundhilfe, I don't know. Anyway, I think they get about 250 euro a month as support. So the IDPs and the refugees are a tremendous challenge, especially in Ukraine and in some other countries. In Poland alone, you have over 2.5 million refugees. After 1 year, I have been told that already 60 to 65% of these refugees already have a job in Poland. Of course, the language helps because the language is pretty similar. What is the second? Energy. Another thing that we have felt and are feeling right now very much. The game that Russia is playing, the attempt to blackmail Europe, to blackmail the world by speculation, by turning off the gas. I think it was well done by the European Union, well confronted by the European Union. And as we see it now, the danger is off. Of course, we all pay too much for our gas prices, but as far as I see it, this should become much better in the course of the next 6 months, especially now that spring will come, and I think the pressure on this specific field will ease. Another thing that didn't touch us so much, but touched a lot of the third world, Africa, South America, some countries in Asia, is the grain. For Egypt, for instance, this is a catastrophe. Egypt is on the brink of defaulting, but this is another initiative where the West has helped a lot to diffuse the situation. With the help of the United Nations and also Turkey, a diplomatic initiative has been found to export about 60–70% of the millions of tons of grain that were exported before the war. And so this situation also is not as acute as it has been, but it's still bad enough for countries like Egypt or Yemen or Ethiopia to suffer a lot. Something else which is important, and it's more geopolitical. Russia could not win within a couple of days as it expected. Putin expected to finish this war in a couple of days. They expected to be greeted in Kiev by Ukrainians, like Hitler was welcomed in Vienna in 1938. This was not the case, because it's true that in Kiev and in the east of Ukraine and in the south of Ukraine, people speak Russian, but they say, I speak Russian, but I'm Ukrainian. I'm a Russian-speaking Ukrainian. Most people that I have met put a lot of emphasis on that and say, we are very proud to be Ukrainians, and we don't want to be Russians, and we don't want to be part of Russia. Now, you might say that in the eastern parts, in Donbass, in the south of Ukraine, especially Odessa, where Russian is very popular, could have said or thought that Russia is popular. Indeed, before the war, there would have been a certain percentage that could have coquetteered, that could have imagined themselves to be part of Russia. But after the public saw what Russia does in the occupied territories, which is deportation, killing, destruction, abduction. Hardly any Ukrainian or Russian-speaking Ukrainian in the south and the east wants to be occupied by Russia. The behavior of the Russian soldiers are so bad that no one wants to be part of that Russia. And that Russia is a dictatorship with oppression and everything. And Ukraine is not a perfect democracy, but you have free media, you can say what you want, you have a free market, but of course you have many issues in the country, like corruption. But all in all, Ukraine is a much more wealthier country than Russia and much more democratic. For Russia, this is a very big problem, that they have not won the war within a couple of days, and they need to win the war because the world is watching what Russia is doing. China is watching what Russia is doing and how they are fighting, because they would very much like to reunite with Taiwan. They try to learn from the mistakes of Russia. You have to look at Central Asia. How are the Central Asians? They are former Soviet Union member states. How are they reacting? They are very, very hesitant. They have been very independent and they don't want to be drawn back into the neo-imperialist behavior of the president. Then you have another weakening of the Russian influence in the South Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Usually you had Russia as the corrigendum. You had Russia with forces there, and they were able to dictate to both parties when they should be quiet. They cannot do it anymore. So Russia is suffering a lot. Also in Syria, for instance, where they had to withdraw a lot of troops from Syria, or in Africa, which is the same, where they had to pool many resources from the Wagner group to Ukraine. So this is a very important point, which will hurt a lot to Russia. Maybe a few words before I stop and give you the floor. EU and NATO. With the 24th of February, this was a Zeitenwende. This was a big break. And the Ukrainian government is not perfect, but they have been elected, especially the president, Zelensky, with 70% of the votes for a very simple reason. People were fed up with the corruption. People were fed up with the promises of having a better life. And so when the new government came to power, they made a series of reforms that were useful, and they have started the war against corruption, which is a war which will last a generation at least, because it's normal in Eastern Europe to give a bribe to your doctor or try to bribe a judge and things like that. But they're working on it. And for them, the application to join the European Union is a possibility to reform the country and to be part of the European Union, as unrealistic as it sounds to us. Of course, Ukraine is a very, very big country. It is 2,000 kilometers from Lemberg, from Lviv, almost 2,000, maybe now, 1,500 kilometers to the eastern borders, close to Russia. So they are very, very, very different histories, different cultures, but still they share the same language, and they are determined to stay together. Just a few words about Austria. Austria, in spite of everything, has done a lot for Ukraine. We have not only taken many refugees, but in the humanitarian fields, we are top 10 in the world. In terms of GDP, we are even number 3 or number 4 in the world, considering humanitarian aid. We are also a very big investor in Ukraine. and we are highly popular, especially in Western Ukraine. The only thing that we cannot do is deliver weapons, even if the Ukrainians would love us to deliver weapons. You know the term Leopard 2, Leopard 2, the tanks. We have them, but we can, of course, not give them to Ukraine. But all in all, even though we have some issues, especially with rich Ukrainians driving around in very big cars in Vienna, and also Russian oligarchs, as well as Ukrainian oligarchs being in Vienna, I think our reputation is very, very good in Austria. Good. I would say that I will come to a close and give you the floor. Petra, life is not as bad as you might think. Of course, it's difficult because I have to commute my family, Petra and the 3 children, they're in Vienna. So obviously this is a non-family posting. You cannot have anyone living with you here in Kiev. That means that, for instance, this weekend I'm coming back to Vienna. So on Friday, I will take the car, drive 10 hours to Uzhgorod, or as some of you might know it as Ungvar, close to Munkac, and then on the day after I will take the train, cross the border, and then take the train and arrive in the late afternoon in Vienna. So it takes me 2 full days to come from Kiev to Vienna because there are no planes. There is no airport. The airport has been closed on the 24th of February. When I travel, I have company. I have company by security guards. So I'm under permanent control of my Cobra agents who take good care of me. In Kiev itself, I have an apartment where sometimes I have electricity, sometimes I don't have electricity. It depends on the attacks. So usually let's say in average, every 10 days, we have a major attack of rockets, caliber rockets, or Iranian drones that are kamikaze-like, getting into transformer stations or electricity or power stations, and they are destroying. If the Ukrainian army doesn't manage to shoot them in mid-air, they are successful, and that means for us 2 or 3 days of being in the dark. Well, that's a weird experience because I leave the office and then I go through a totally dark city where you have no street light. You will only have the lights of the cars. Then you enter your apartment. Of course, you have to take the stairs because the lift doesn't work. Then I stumble around the apartment and try to find my lamp. I have a lamp which is like a mobile phone, and you can load it with you can like a power bank. So I will press the button, and then Fiat lux. There is light, a little bit at least. But you know, you get used to it to a certain degree, and I'm fine because at the end of the day I can always walk back to the embassy, because in the embassy we have a big generator and we have light and we have heating, so it's not such a big problem. And I'm living in the city center where we are very privileged to have light. Outside the city center, like my household woman or my assistant, they have not more than 2 to 6 hours electricity a day. What do? Well, they have a fireplace. They just have assembled wood during summer because we knew what was coming. Or my assistant who lives in a suburb of Kiev, they have installed so-called invincibility centers. These are tents. Also the Israel Mashav has put up a tent, which is heated. You have coffee and tea and cookies. You have a couple of beds. You have a lot of power banks. You have so-called Akkumulatoren, where you can load up your mobile phone or your iPhone or your iPad. And so people have adapted to this very difficult life. And fortunately, winter is very mild. So this makes life easier. But in spite of everything, all the restaurants open. If there is no electricity, you just order the menu without electricity. It's called a menu, black menu, for blackout menu. All your cinemas are working, opera is working, concerts are working. You can get a massage if you want. You can go to the gym if you want. Everything is open. Yeah.
Thank you, Arad. And now I think I leave the floor for the audience and I pass on to
Question to answer our questions. And thank you, of course, all our audience, our WIZO friends, that you decide to spend this evening with us. A small remember, please, to our bank account, which is in the chat. I wish you all a successful week, and I hope to see you soon at one of our WIZO events. Shalom and good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All the best. Good. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.